This is the fifth podcast in a series about alcoholism. Good morning, Andy F.
Good morning, George. How are you?
Recovering alcoholic since 1984.
Yes, it's been a while now.
And now writing a book, but we'll come to that later. Today's podcast, a pretty heavy headline, Self-Pity versus Depression in Recovery from Alcoholism.
I agree that it's quite a heavy topic, George, but it's a topic that is very relevant to many alcoholics when they first come to AA. And it's a topic that does need to be addressed and understood so that alcoholics know what is happening to them when they first get sober. It's a direct symptom of the disease of alcoholism, and it's so negative and so self-defeating that at times it can lead to relapse, and often does lead to relapse.
So what is self-pity? How can you describe it? What's the definition?
In AA, self-pity is seen as a defect of character and not a feeling. It's a trait of character that the alcoholic develops as he's drinking alcohol and leading his very self-destructive lifestyle. When an alcoholic drinks, he can feel very sorry for himself of all the mistakes that he's made and the consequences, the negative consequences of his drinking, both while he's drinking and also when he comes into sobriety. Very often when alcoholics first get sober, they find it very difficult to accept the things that they have lost as a direct result of their drinking, or the things that they never managed to get also as a direct result of their drinking. So acceptance at times is very difficult for alcoholics in early recovery.
So are there similarities between alcoholic self-pity and depression?
There are striking similarities between self-pity and depression, but we need to be very clear here that clinical depression and self-pity are not the same, and there's often a great deal of confusion in AA about what constitutes depression and what constitutes self-pity. They both need to be treated very differently from one another, but they are totally different.
Self-pity and depression, is it often mentioned in the AA literature, for example?
There's a really good online resource, a website called www.164andmore, and it's a kind of a resource website of the AA literature, specifically the AA Big Book and the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, both books written by Bill Wilson. And if you put a word or a phrase into the search engine of this website, it will tell you exactly how many times that word has appeared in the AA literature, and it will give you the place in the literature where the word appeared. It will give you the sentence or the paragraph in which that particular word or phrase has appeared.
164andmore.com, is that correct?
164andmore.com. In this particular resource, the word self-pity appears 20 times in the Big Book and the 12 and 12, which I think you'll agree is quite a lot of times. Bill Wilson made 20 references to self-pity in the literature of AA.
So self-pity and depression in recovery from alcoholism. So what's the dictionary definition of self-pity?
The dictionary definition of self-pity is feeling sorry for oneself, being depressed about one's situation. Now, the dictionary definition of depression is a period of unhappiness or low morale which lasts longer than several weeks and may include ideation of self-inflicted injury or suicide. Now, you may notice from the first definition about self-pity that the word depressed is used in that definition, feeling sorry for oneself, being depressed about one's situation. So it's fairly clear that self-pity and depression are similar. They're strikingly similar, in fact, but they are not the same, and they need to be treated very differently when in recovery from alcoholism.
What is the connection between alcoholism and self-pity? Is it different?
Well, alcoholics lead a very self-destructive lifestyle. Their emotional maturity is stunted. The theory is that they stop growing emotionally when they start drinking alcohol. So it could be said that self-pity is very common in alcoholics, and it's a sign of emotional immaturity. But also, it's a consequence of a very self-destructive lifestyle that alcoholics engage in. Very often alcoholics come into recovery and they've lost absolutely everything that they've worked hard to build up in their lives directly as a result of alcohol. Other times, alcoholics are so addicted to alcohol that they achieve very little in their lives because their lives are spent drinking. So the self-pity comes from either having lost a great deal to alcohol, or having not achieved very much or got very much from drinking in the first place.
What did the founder of AA, Bill Wilson, have to say about self-pity?
Bill Wilson, as I've mentioned, who mentioned the word self-pity 20 times in the literature, suffered from horrendous self-pity when he first got sober, particularly in his first 2 years of sobriety. He later went on to develop quite serious, debilitating depression, but that's another subject. In his early days, he suffered from self-pity, and there's a very interesting excerpt in Bill's story in the big book, which is known as Bill's Story, in which he describes his experiences with self-pity, and I thought that I would read it for the benefit of the listener. My wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics to a solution of their problems. It was fortunate, for my old business associates remained skeptical for a year and a half, during which time I found little work. I was not too well at the time and was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. This sometimes nearly drove me back to drink, but I soon found that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. Many times I have gone to my old hospital in despair. On talking to a man there, I would be amazingly lifted up and set on my feet. It is a design for living that works in rough going. So that's a very interesting quote from Bill, and it's very clear to see that he saw his self-pity experiences with self-pity and resentment as very rough going in his sobriety, and he also declares that these two things nearly drove him back to drinking.
So his own, Bill Wilson's own experience with depression, how was that?
Later on in his sobriety, Bill Wilson developed, and this is going into his sobriety several years, Bill Wilson developed very serious depression. It debilitated him for a long time. In fact, I think that I read in the AA literature that Bill's depression lasted 11 years in sobriety. 7 of those years he reports as his depression being suicidal, so it was very serious depression. He wrote a very interesting article which was published in the AA magazine called The Grapevine in January 1958. The article that is available online is called Emotional Sobriety, The Next Frontier. If you Google that, you will find the whole article. It's a very interesting article. I'll repeat that again. Emotional Sobriety, The Next Frontier. There's one particular little quote that I would like to offer you that really, in which Bill talks about his depression. This is the quote. Last autumn, several years back, depression, having no real rational cause at all, almost took me to the cleaners. I began to be scared that I was in for another long chronic spell. Considering the grief I've had with depression, it wasn't a bright prospect. So that is Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, openly admitting to the fact that he suffered from depression.
You are listening to the 5th podcast in a series about alcoholism. And the F with me as usual. What are some of the attitudes regarding depression in AA by the more fundamental AA members?
Most of AA have a very mature and philosophical attitude towards people that suffer from depression in sobriety, and these people are often referred to their doctors or to go for a psychiatric assessment to get their depression treated. But that's not the case with everybody in AA. There is the more fundamentalist members in AA have a very negative attitude towards depression as a bona fide mental health issue. They declare that depression is nothing more than self-pity and has to be treated with the steps and with writing daily gratitude lists. And this is very helpful to write daily gratitude lists. They were very helpful to me, but it's not always the right treatment to treat a clinical depression. And there have been some fairly unfortunate consequences of AA members being told to stop taking their medication and just work on their program, and that they weren't suffering from depression at all, but alcoholic self-pity.
So your advice is, if you're on antidepressants, for example, you continue them, you don't listen to what AA...
No one in AA is qualified to tell another AA member to stop taking their antidepressant medication. That is something that is entirely between that member and his doctor. If a doctor prescribes medication, then that member should take the medication, and any attitudes in AA are completely irrelevant. In fact, I would tell people that admit to me that they're on medication in AA to not share openly about the fact that they use antidepressant medication in sobriety, because they might get some very unfortunate, erroneous and negative attitudes coming back at them.
From some members?
From some fundamentalist members, yeah.
So what has been your own personal experience with opinions of the more fundamentalist members about your depressive mental state in early recovery?
Now, I'm not saying here that I didn't suffer from self-pity. I did. I did suffer from self-pity, and there's no denying that. And the gratitude lists that I had to write for my sponsors were very helpful in overcoming my self-pity. But I also, in very early sobriety, suffered from a very debilitating depressive illness. I couldn't function in the world. I was so depressed that there were times when I couldn't even get out of bed and go to the bathroom. I was so depressed. I was constantly ruminating about very negative things in my mind and wondering whether or not there was any point in me continuing with my life. And these feelings and thoughts were so strong that nothing that I did in AA would help to relieve them. So eventually I went to a doctor who prescribed medication. When I got some sponsors in AA that were more in the fundamentalist camp in AA, I was told that the steps would not work for me if I was on medication. That I was also told that I was eating my alcohol in the form of tablets when they found out that I was taking antidepressant medication. I was told that I was wasting my time in AA trying to work the steps and recover from alcoholism if I was on antidepressant medication. This is very dangerous and erroneous information to give to what is sometimes a vulnerable person, a vulnerable newcomer in AA.
Gratitude list, you have mentioned that a few times. Spill the secret now. What is a gratitude list?
When I was ready, and I was on antidepressant medication already, I believe personally that I wouldn't have survived in AA were it not for my medication. I agreed to start writing gratitude lists, and I did this every day for a couple of years. Every morning I had to write a detailed gratitude list and list all the things that I had to be grateful for every day, and each day I had to add new things to the list. And I found that this practice was amazingly effective in helping me to learn how to see my glass half full rather than half empty, which is quite a popular way of describing it in AA. In AA, we are told that we learn to see our glass half full rather than half empty. It was amazing how much the daily gratitude list helped to change my attitude and helped me to overcome my frequent bouts of self-pity.
So give us a short example of today's gratitude list from Andy.
Well, the first and most important thing that I'm grateful for is that I am sober today, and that that to a large extent I have recovered from the mental and physical aspect and spiritual aspect of my illness. I have a very good life. I'm happy, I'm at peace, I'm content, I enjoy my life, and I'm very grateful for the life that the 12 steps have given me. It's nothing compared to the misery and suffering that I experienced in my early sobriety.
You listen to the 5th podcast in a series about alcoholism. Andy F. in the studio. Andy, what's your own story with depression in the recovery?
I suffered from very, very crippling depression for many years in sobriety. Like I said, I was almost unable to function. I was actually given a diagnosis after several years of being in AA, which confirmed that I had another problem, another coexisting mental health issue besides my alcoholism. I was diagnosed by a therapist as having borderline personality disorder. Now, some alcoholics, believe it or not, come into recovery with BPD, and this has to be treated separately than alcoholism. BPD is quite a serious personality disorder that needs to be treated with specific types of therapy and medication and antidepressant medication. What I always say to newcomers that come to me and admit to me that they're on medication and ask me what my opinion about the use of antidepressant medication in sobriety is, this is what I tell them. Medication enabled me to do the 12 steps of recovery, and the 12 steps of recovery enabled me to eventually come off my medication, and that's what I tell people that ask me about this issue.
So you were on antidepressants or on benzos? Or?
I was on antidepressants for almost 20 years in sobriety. I've been off all medication now for about 15 years, and I'm off that medication because I went through the steps several times with different sponsors, and I got to a place where I just felt that I didn't really need it anymore. I had such a positive outlook on life. I dealt with my past through the steps, and I eventually weaned myself off antidepressants.
Is there a difference between alcoholic self-pity and depression which require medical treatment?
It's very, very important that the listener understands that there is a significant difference between the self-pity that Bill Wilson mentions so frequently in the literature and clinical depression. There's an enormous difference. Self-pity is treated with the suggestions of a sponsor and the 12 steps, and depression can only be treated with professional outside psychiatric help.
Andy, what would you say to a newcomer that was on medication for depression?
Well, exactly what I've said is that they should continue taking their medication. If it's prescribed by a medically qualified physician, they should not listen to any advice that they hear in AA about coming off their medication and that the 12 steps won't work for them if they continue taking their antidepressants. As I've said before, I tell newcomers that antidepressant medication enabled me, they empowered me to do the 12 steps, and the 12 steps enabled and empowered me to eventually come off my medication.
So the solution to self-pity is?
The solution to self-pity is developing and cultivating an attitude of gratitude. The suggestions offered in AA by competent sponsors is the gratitude list. This is a very important aspect of the daily suggestions that sponsors give their sponsees. I always give a daily gratitude list to my sponsees, and it really does help them to start feeling more positive about their sobriety.
Can praying be useful to handle self-pity?
Even I believe so. Even though I identify as an agnostic, I think that praying is in itself a very positive affirmation. First of all, getting on your knees is a demonstration of surrender to the idea that you're not capable of managing your own life on your own power or resources. Also, praying is a dialogue between the well part of you, the part of you that has come into recovery, the part of you that I call the authentic self. I personally believe that the maladapted alcoholic ego of the alcoholic is the part of the alcoholic that generates self-pity. In prayer, it's a direct communication between the maladapted alcoholic ego and the authentic self that is naturally happy, at peace and contented. So I think that it's a very positive thing to do.
Going back to depression, what is the solution to depression?
The solution to depression is psychiatric intervention or medical intervention. There are some very, very good antidepressant medications available on the market. It is my heartfelt belief that if Bill Wilson, if antidepressant medication were available in Bill Wilson's day, he would have undoubtedly been on antidepressant medication. Because antidepressants weren't available in those days, Bill Wilson sought treatment for his depression through other methods, which I mentioned in my last podcasts, but definitely there's a lot of very effective medications out there today for depression.
You have had many sponsees and have sponsees. Has working with other alcoholics helped you to overcome your own problems with self-pity and depression?
Absolutely. There's a line in the big book that Bill Wilson wrote, and I'll quote the line because it's so important to remember. The line is, "Our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depends on our constant thought of others and how we can meet their needs." This is a very important and powerful statement that Bill makes, because whenever I am thinking about how I can meet the needs of other alcoholics in AA, I'm not thinking about myself. And when I'm not thinking about myself, I'm happier and I have less of a tendency to drift into negative thinking or self-pity. So working intensively with other alcoholics, being helpful, doing service, sponsoring when you're ready to sponsor is also a very helpful, proactive treatment against negative thinking and self-pity.
And we are in the beginning of year 2021. You are writing your first book. regarding alcoholism. Tell us.
Yes, I'm writing a book about my experiences of recovery as an agnostic alcoholic in AA. I came into recovery as a complete agnostic, and I was actually quite disturbed when I saw the mention of the God word in the AA literature. The God word and the higher power word appears in 6 of the 12 steps, and I was unable to do the steps because I had so much prejudice about the God word. So I didn't do the steps, I didn't get a sponsor, I didn't work the steps, and I almost paid the ultimate price of losing my life to alcoholism. So I wrote this book because I think that it may be a useful resource for some agnostic alcoholics that cannot tolerate the God word. I have found that the 12 steps of recovery are just as effective for non-believers as they are for believers. All that needs to happen is that the alcoholic needs to replace his conception of a power greater than himself with something that he can accept and is understandable. For example, my sponsor told me to use the AA program as a power greater than myself, and for many years I used that as my higher power. So what my book is about is that the steps are just as effective for non-believers as they are for believers.
So how do we get your book? Can we buy it online soon?
My book will be published on Amazon in the latter part of this year, and if you are struggling with the God word, or you're not sure whether or not AA is for you because of the idea that AA is some kind of a quasi-religion, then I assure you that my book may prove to be a very useful resource in your sobriety.
And here comes the link to your website.
The link to my website is www.aaforagnostics.com, all one word. AA for Agnostics is all one word, so you just put in aaforagnostics.com.
And the Facebook page where we ask you to go in and like it is AA for Agnostics.
Yes.
Thank you, Andy, for coming today. This was the 5th edition of the series of podcasts about alcoholism.
Thank you very much for having me, George. It's a pleasure to be here.